The ivy-choked ruins of Westford Abbey stand today as a grim monument to a man who traded an empire for an illusion. They say treason destroys a kingdom, but for Aidan Harrington, it was a whisper in the dark from a ghost of his past. He chose the fragile sighs of his childhood love over the fierce devotion of his lawful Duchess, utterly blind to the reality that it was her iron will and her vast fortune holding his crumbling world together. The marriage between Lady Beatrice Cavendish and Aidan Harrington, the Duke of Westford, was celebrated as the union of the decade. The London papers of 1884 exhausted their supplies of ink, detailing the staggering opulence of the ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. It was an alliance forged in the cold, calculating fires of aristocratic necessity. The Harringtons possessed one of the oldest and most revered titles in England, stretching back to the Plantagenets, but their coffers were notoriously empty. Decades of gambling, poor investments, and agricultural blight had left the great Westford estate on the brink of catastrophic foreclosure. Beatrice, on the other hand, was the sole heir to the Cavendish fortune, a staggering accumulation of wealth built on Northern Railway's shipping lines and coal. She did not enter the marriage with the naive delusions of a romance novel heroine. Beatrice was a pragmatist, blessed with a sharp analytical mind and a quiet, dignified beauty. She knew her wealth was purchasing a coronet, and in exchange, she was expected to provide an heir and restore the rotting foundations of Westford. Yet deep within the guarded chambers of her heart, she harboured a quiet hope. Aidan was undeniably handsome with brooding storm-grey eyes and a charming, if melancholic, smile. During their brief courtship, he had been courteous, attentive, and seemingly grateful for the salvation she offered. Beatrice had believed that respect might eventually blossom into affection, and perhaps in time love. The illusion shattered before the ink on their marriage lines was fully dry. Upon their arrival at Westford Manor, a sprawling Palladian monstrosity that smelled faintly of damp wood and despair, Aidan's demeanour changed. The attentive suitor vanished, replaced by a distant, distracted stranger. He fulfilled his marital duties with a chilling mechanical detachment, often leaving her chambers before the dawn broke over the rolling hills of the estate. Beatrice threw herself into her duties to stave off the biting chill of rejection. She proved to be a masterful administrator. Where Aidan was willfully blind to the mechanics of his own home, Beatrice was formidable. She immediately audited the estate's ledgers, horrifying the long-standing complacent steward, Mr. Thomas Finch. She dismissed the corrupt overseers, renegotiated the tenant leases to be fair but profitable, and injected thousands of pounds of her own Cavendish capital into repairing the leaking roofs, the crumbling stone facades, and the exhausted soil of the tenant farms. Within 2 years, Westford Manor was resurrected from its grave. The great halls were warm, the servants were paid on time, and the social elite of London once again flocked to their grand autumn hunting parties. Yet the more Beatrice fixed, the further Aidan drifted. He developed a sudden obsessive habit of taking long solitary rides toward the eastern borders of the estate, near the village of Little Hangleton. He would return hours later, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth, his eyes alight with a strange feverish energy that Beatrice never saw when he looked at her. The turning point occurred on a crisp Tuesday in late October. Beatrice was seated in the morning room reviewing the winter fuel expenditures when her head housemaid, Mrs. Gable, a fiercely loyal woman who had accompanied Beatrice from the Cavendish household, entered and closed the heavy oak door behind her with conspicuous care. "Your Grace." Mrs. Gable began, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, her hands nervously smoothing her starched apron. "There is talk in the village. Talk that I felt it was my duty to bring to your attention, lest you be caught unawares by the malice of idle tongues." Beatrice did not look up from her ledger, her copperplate handwriting flowing smoothly across the page. "Speak plainly, Mrs. Gable. I have little patience for riddles this morning." "It is his Grace, ma'am. The villagers say he is not riding out for the fresh air. He is visiting the old cottage by the mill, the one that used to belong to Mr. Hayes, the former bailiff." Beatrice's pen paused. A drop of black ink gathered at the nib and fell, staining the crisp white page. Mr. Hayes had died 5 years ago, disgraced after being caught embezzling from the estate. But he had a daughter Aidan had practically grown up with before he was sent away to Eton, and who currently resides in this cottage, Mrs. Gable. Beatrice asked, her voice dangerously calm. Aurora Hayes, Your Grace. She returned from London a month ago. They say she is a widow now left destitute, and that His Grace has taken it upon himself to see to her comfort. A heavy silence descended upon the morning room. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded like the beating of a war drum. Beatrice closed the ledger with a soft, definitive thud. The puzzle pieces of her husband's distant behavior, his sudden joy and his mysterious absences, clicked into a horrifying, humiliating picture. Aidan had not merely found a mistress. He had returned to a childhood infatuation, a ghost from his past that he had been forced to abandon when his father demanded he marry for money. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Beatrice said, her expression entirely unreadable. You will speak of this to no one. If I hear even a whisper of this from the lower housemaids, I will know whom to hold responsible. Of course, Your Grace. Not a word. As the maids scurried from the room, Beatrice walked to the towering window overlooking the impeccably manicured lawns, paid for by her father's coal mines. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her chest. She was a Cavendish. She had bought this estate, she had saved this title, and she would not be made a fool of by a bankrupt duke and a disgraced bailiff's daughter. The war for Westford had quietly begun. Aurora Hayes was precisely the sort of woman society gentlemen found impossible to resist, and aristocratic wives found utterly contemptible. She possessed a frail, weeping willow sort of beauty, pale skin, large, perpetually tear-filled hazel eyes, and a soft, trembling voice that made men feel instantly powerful and fiercely protective. Where Beatrice was a pillar of marble and intellect, Aurora was spun sugar and calculated vulnerability. For Aidan, Aurora represented a time before the crushing weight of his dukedom, before the debts, and before the imposing competent presence of his wealthy wife. He had fancied himself in love with Aurora when they were 17, stealing kisses in the apple orchards. Her sudden return to the village, claiming to be the victim of a cruel, abusive marriage to a London merchant who had left her penniless, was the perfect catalyst for Aidan's saviour complex. It did not take long for the private whispers to become public spectacles. Emboldened by Aidan's unwavering affection and blind financial support, Aurora's demands began to escalate. It started with Aidan moving her from the damp cottage by the mill into a charming, modernised townhouse on the edge of the estate. Then came the dresses, extravagant silks, and lace from Paris, billed directly to the Westford estate accounts. Beatrice, reviewing the bills with her sharp eyes, recognised the blatant theft immediately, but chose to bide her time gathering evidence with the cold precision of a prosecuting attorney. The breaking point arrived during the annual Westford Autumn Gala, an event Beatrice had spent months meticulously organising to cement the Harringtons' political alliances in the House of Lords. Over 200 members of the peerage were in attendance. The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tailcoats. Halfway through the evening, a hush fell over the grand staircase. Beatrice, engaged in conversation with the Earl of Clarendon, turned to see her husband descending the stairs. But he was not alone. Clinging to his arm, wearing a spectacular gown of sapphire velvet that perfectly matched the famous Harrington sapphire necklace, a family heirloom Aidan had claimed was being cleaned in London, was Aurora Hayes. The audacity of the gesture sent shockwaves through the room. It was one thing to keep a mistress quietly in St. John's Wood. It was an entirely different, unforgivable insult to parade her in the ancestral home, wearing the family jewels in front of the Lawful Duchess and the entirety of polite society. Beatrice did not flinch. She did not weep or cause a scene. She simply excused herself from the Earl, her spine perfectly rigid, and walked toward her husband. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Aidan, Beatrice said, her voice perfectly modulated to carry just far enough for the front row of onlookers to hear. I see you have brought a guest. And how remarkable. She seems to have borrowed the necklace that my father spent £3,000 restoring for the estate. Aidan stiffened his face, flushing with a mix of embarrassment and defensive anger. Aurora shrank behind him, burying her face against his shoulder and letting out a pathetic, trembling gasp. "Beatrice, do not make a scene," Aidan hissed through clenched teeth. "Aurora has had a difficult time. She needed a night of joy. You have everything: the title, the wealth, the respect of the county. Can you not allow her this one evening?" Beatrice looked at the snivelling woman, then back to the man she had pulled from the brink of ruin. "I am the Duchess of Westford," Beatrice said softly, her eyes glittering with a dangerous icy fire. "I have everything because I paid for everything, Aidan, including the roof over your head and the boots on your feet. You will escort this woman from my home immediately, or I will have the footmen throw her into the gravel." "You would not dare," Aidan challenged, his ego overriding his fragile sense of reality. "This is my house, the Harrington estate. Aurora stays. Then enjoy your evening, Your Grace," Beatrice replied without missing a beat. She turned her back on him, signaling to the orchestra to resume playing. She spent the rest of the night acting the perfect hostess, projecting an aura of complete unbothered grace. But internally, the last lingering embers of her hope for the marriage turned to ash. Aidan had publicly chosen his childhood fantasy over his lawful reality. He had humiliated her. Later that night, in the privacy of his study, Aidan attempted to justify his actions. He found Beatrice sitting by the fire, waiting for him. "You forced my hand, Beatrice." He began pacing the floor. "I never wanted to marry you. My father forced me into it because we needed the Cavendish money. I appreciate what you have done for the estate, I truly do. But Aurora is my heart. She knows the real me. Not the Duke, but Aidan. She needs me. She needs my money." "Aidan," Beatrice corrected smoothly, not raising her voice. "And you need a mirror that reflects only your delusions of grandeur. You are a weak man who prefers the company of a woman who flatters you over a wife who challenges you." "I will not be spoken to this way in my own home," Aidan shouted, slamming a fist on the desk. "I am the Duke of Westford. You are a duke in name." Beatrice stood up the firelight, casting long, imposing shadows behind her. "But I am the power in this house. If you wish to play the tragic romantic hero with your little steward's daughter, you may do so, but do not expect me to finance the production." She swept from the room, leaving Aidan glaring into the flames, convinced of his own righteousness, entirely oblivious to the lethal trap he had just stepped into. The morning after the gala, the atmosphere at Westford Manor was irrevocably changed. The servants moved like ghosts, sensing the catastrophic shift in the household's power dynamics. Aidan, emboldened by surviving the confrontation without any immediate explosions, began to act with reckless impunity. He openly moved Aurora into the manor's east wing, claiming she required the country air to recover her nerves. Aurora, sensing her victory quickly, shed the guise of the timid victim behind closed doors. She began giving orders to the staff, criticizing the menus Beatrice had approved, and even attempting to rearrange the furniture in the drawing rooms. She whispered poisons into Aidan's ear, daily painting Beatrice as a cold, calculating tyrant who viewed Aidan merely as a pawn for her own social climbing. "She doesn't love you, Aidan," Aurora murmured one afternoon, tracing the lapel of his hunting jacket as they sat in the conservatory. "She only loves the title. She looks at you and sees an employee, but I look at you and see my king." Aidan swallowed the flattery like a man dying of thirst. "I know, my darling. I will not let her oppress us any longer. I am the master of Westford." But while Aidan and Aurora played at being lord and lady of the manor, Beatrice was quietly, methodically declaring war. She did not seek comfort in the arms of another man, nor did she retreat to her bed to cry. Instead, she took the train to London and walked into the austere, oak-panelled offices of Mr. Reginald Abernathy, the senior partner at Abernathy Cole, and Partners, the most ruthless firm of solicitors in the city. Mr. Abernathy had drawn up the marriage settlements on behalf of Beatrice's late father, the Earl of Devonshire. "Your Grace," Mr. Abernathy greeted her, adjusting his spectacles as he took in her grim expression. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "I require a review of my marriage settlements, Mr. Abernathy," Beatrice said, taking a seat and removing her gloves. specifically the clauses regarding the discretionary trusts and the capital allocated for the maintenance of the Westford estate. Abernathy pulled the massive leather-bound file from his vault. For hours they pored over the intricate legal jargon. Beatrice's father had been a shrewd, paranoid businessman. While the law of the land heavily favoured husbands giving them control over their wives' properties, the Earl of Devonshire had utilised a complex web of independent trusts to protect the core Cavendish fortune. As it stands, Your Grace. Mr. Abernathy explained, tapping a heavily inked paragraph. The principal sum of the Cavendish estate remains locked in trust, accessible only by you. However, the income generated the dividends which you have been pouring into Westford Manor for repairs and upkeep technically falls under your husband's purview once deposited into the joint estate accounts. But I have not deposited the next quarter's dividends yet. Beatrice noted, her eyes sharp. Indeed. If you were to redirect those dividends into a private account held solely in your name at the Bank of England, His Grace would have no legal right to them without initiating a highly public, highly scandalous chancery lawsuit. And what of the rolling accounts, the money used to pay the servants, the butchers, the coal merchants? If you withdraw your personal signature from those accounts, the burden of credit falls entirely on the Duke of Westford. Given his historical credit rating before your marriage, Mr. Abernathy allowed a rare grim smile to touch his lips. He would not secure a loan for a loaf of bread in London. Excellent, Beatrice murmured. Draft the necessary documents, Reginald. Freeze the transfers. Redirect all incoming Cavendish capital to my private London accounts. Cut off the estate's access to my trusts. Your Grace, this will bankrupt the estate within 3 months. Abernathy warned, though there was a glint of professional admiration in his eye. The winter is approaching. The maintenance costs alone. Let him warm himself with his pride, Beatrice said coldly. Over the next few weeks, Beatrice orchestrated her departure with the strategic brilliance of a military general. She quietly arranged for her loyal staff, including Mrs. Gable, to be transferred to her London townhouse. She packed her personal belongings, her art, and the jewels that belonged to the Cavendish line. Aidan barely noticed. He was too consumed with Aurora, who was now demanding a grand winter ball to celebrate her recovery. Aidan agreed, ordering the estate manager to hire the finest caterers and musicians from London. When the manager nervously informed Aidan that the estate's operational accounts were unexpectedly overdrawn, Aidan casually waved him off. Send the bills to the Duchess's accountant, Aidan said dismissively. She always handles the ledgers. But the Duchess was no longer handling the ledgers. On a grey, windswept morning in late November, a procession of 4 black carriages bearing the Cavendish crest stood on the gravel driveway of Westford Manor. Beatrice stood in the grand foyer draped in a heavy velvet travelling cloak. She looked around the magnificent hall. She had restored the polished oak floors, the gleaming chandeliers, the restored tapestries. She felt a brief pang of sorrow, not for the man she was leaving, but for the home she had poured her soul into. Aidan emerged from the breakfast room, a piece of toast in hand, looking bewildered at the mountain of trunks. Aurora trailed behind him, clutching her silk dressing gown, her eyes wide with a mix of triumph and confusion. Beatrice, what is the meaning of this? Aidan demanded. Where are you going? I am leaving Aidan, Beatrice said, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. I am returning to London. You have made it abundantly clear that there is no place for me here, save as your financier, and I am resigning from that position. Aurora smirked, leaning against Aidan. Well, if you must go, go. We shall manage perfectly well without your sour face ruining the atmosphere. Aidan puffed out his chest. If you leave this house, Beatrice, do not expect to come crawling back when you realize the scandal you have caused. I will not stop you. Westford has stood for 500 years without a Cavendish, and it will stand for 500 more. Beatrice looked at him, a sudden terrifyingly serene smile gracing her lips. It was a smile of pure lethal checkmate. I am sure it will, Your Grace, Beatrice replied softly, stepping out into the biting winter air. I leave you to your kingdom, and to your debts. The heavy oak doors closed with a resounding thud, sealing Aidan and Aurora inside. They had won the manor, but they were entirely unaware that the foundation had just been ripped out from beneath them. The storm was coming, and Aidan Harrington had no shelter left. For the first fortnight following Beatrice's departure, a delusional euphoria reigned over Westford Manor. Aidan Harrington finally felt like the undisputed sovereign of his own domain. There were no more sharp questions about expenditures, no more ledgers dominating the morning room, and no more cold-assessing stares from his wife. Aurora, too, revelled in her elevated status. She drifted through the grand corridors in silk dressing gowns, long past noon, ordering the remaining skeleton crew of servants with a shrill, imperious tone that grated against the ancient stone walls. They spent their evenings by roaring fires, drinking the last of the fine French brandy Beatrice had imported, and spinning grand, impossible plans for the estate. Aidan promised Aurora they would landscape the South Gardens to rival Versailles, and Aurora spoke of the magnificent winter ball she would host, a dazzling spectacle that would cement her place as the true beloved lady of the county. But reality is a relentless creditor, and its first collection notice arrived with the first deep freeze of December. It began with the coal. Westford Manor, with its 74 rooms, towering ceilings, and draughty Palladian windows, required an obscene amount of fuel to remain habitable during the brutal Yorkshire winters. When the estate's coal bunkers ran low, the head footman dispatched a message to Mr. Higgins, the local merchant, who had supplied the Harringtons for 3 generations. The cart did not arrive. Instead, a terse handwritten note was delivered to the steward's office. Aidan was in the library attempting to teach Aurora how to play billiards when Mr. Thomas Finch, the aging estate steward, requested an audience. Finch looked older than his 60 years, his shoulders bowed under an invisible weight, clutching a stack of invoices that trembled slightly in his weathered hands. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," Finch murmured, refusing to look at Aurora, who was draped provocatively over the edge of the billiard table. "But there is a matter of urgent estate business. The coal merchants have refused our order." Aidan chalked his cue stick with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Refused nonsense, Finch. Higgins has supplied this house since my grandfather's time. Send him a sharp note reminding him of his loyalties, and tell him the payment will be settled at the end of the quarter as always." "I have already done so, Your Grace," Finch replied, his voice strained. Mr. Higgins responded that he cannot extend credit. He stated quite explicitly that his accounts were previously guaranteed by the Duchess's London solicitors. Since Abernathy Cole and Partners issued a formal notice to all county tradesmen last week that Her Grace is no longer underwriting Westford's debts, all lines of credit have been severed. The cue stick slipped, scratching violently against the green felt. Aidan's head snapped up. Abernathy sent a notice to the tradesmen. "To everyone, Your Grace," Finch said, laying the stack of invoices on the mahogany desk. "The butcher, the blacksmith, the grocer. The roofers who were scheduled to repair the east wing have abandoned the scaffolding. Even the local vicar sent a very polite yet firm inquiry regarding the sudden cessation of your quarterly parish donation. Your Grace, the accounts are entirely empty. The incoming agricultural rents barely cover the interest on your father's old debts." "This is absurd," Aurora cried out, her sweet melodic voice cracking into something sharp and ugly. "Aidan is the Duke of Westford. His name alone is worth more than the entire village combined. A title cannot be burned in the hearth to keep the pipes from freezing, madam," Finch said coldly, turning his back on her to face Aidan. "We have enough coal for perhaps 3 days if we close off the guest wings and isolate ourselves to the main floor. The servants' wages are due on Friday. I have nothing to pay them with." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Aidan's armour of hubris. He ordered Finch out and spent the next 3 days desperately riding to local banks in Leeds and York, attempting to secure a bridging loan. But the banking world was a tight-knit fraternity, and the Cavendish influence was vast. Every bank manager offered him the same polite, sympathetic smile and the exact same refusal. The financial market knew what Aidan was only just realizing: Westford Estate had no intrinsic liquid value. It was a massive decaying liability, and Beatrice had been its sole life support. By the second week of December, the great manor had turned into an icebox. Without coal, the damp seeped into the tapestries, and frost formed on the inside of the magnificent windows. To conserve fuel, Aidan was forced to shut down 2/3 of the house, dragging dust sheets over the gilded furniture Beatrice had so lovingly restored. The staff, realizing they were not going to be paid, began to desert in droves. The French chef departed first, taking a carriage back to London and leaving a note demanding back pay. The footmen, the chambermaids and the stable boys followed, until only Finch and a few elderly, fiercely loyal retainers remained. The romance of poverty quickly lost its appeal for Aurora. The spun sugar fragility she had used to ensnare Aidan melted away, revealing a woman of profound entitlement and petty rage. She hated the cold. She hated the meagre meals of boiled mutton and root vegetables prepared by a scullery maid. Most of all, she hated the realization that the golden cage she thought she had conquered was entirely hollow. "You promised me a life, Aidan," she shrieked one evening, huddled under a mountain of furs in the drawing room, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "You promised me London society, beautiful gowns and a warm hearth. Look at this place, it is a tomb. I am doing everything I can. Aurora." Aidan snapped his own temper, fraying under the relentless stress and the gnawing humiliation of his impotence. "You said you loved me. You said you only needed me, not the title. I am not a martyr, Aidan." She spat back, her hazel eyes hard and calculating. "I survived one life of poverty. I will not suffer another because you were too stupid to secure your wife's purse strings before you drove her away." The words hung in the freezing air, a brutal, unforgiving truth that shattered the last remnants of their romantic fantasy. Aidan stared at the woman he had traded his empire for, and for the very first time, he saw her not as a victim in need of saving, but as a parasite furious that her host was bleeding dry. Despite the catastrophic collapse of his finances, Aidan clung to the delusion of the grand winter ball with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Aurora had demanded it, insisting that a magnificent showing would convince the county that the Harringtons were still powerful, thereby restoring their credit. Driven by a toxic mix of pride and a desperate need to placate his increasingly vicious mistress, Aidan committed an act of aristocratic sacrilege. He rode to a discreet pawnbroker in York and pawned the Harrington signet ring, a heavy gold piece passed down from father to son since the reign of Henry VIII. The funds were barely enough to hire a string quartet from the city, purchase a few dozen bottles of mediocre champagne, and light the grand ballroom with hundreds of wax candles. Invitations pressed with the family crest had been sent to 150 of the most prominent families in Yorkshire and London. The night of the ball arrived with a bitter, howling snowstorm. Aurora spent hours preparing, wearing a scandalous gown of crimson silk she had ordered from Paris on credit weeks ago. Credit she now knew Aidan could not pay. She stood before the grand mirrors, pinching her cheeks to bring out the colour, adjusting the paste jewels at her throat, ready to play the conquering queen. At 8 o'clock, the musicians struck up a lively waltz. Aidan stood at the foot of the grand staircase in his finest evening tails, his heart hammering against his ribs. By 9 o'clock, the driveway remained utterly empty. By 10 o'clock, the musicians had stopped playing their instruments, resting in their laps as they exchanged uncomfortable glances. The hundreds of candles burned down, casting long, mocking shadows across the polished oak floors. The lavish buffet of imported fruits and roasted meats sat untouched, slowly congealing in the chilly air of the vast room. No one had come. Not the Earl of Clarendon, not the local magistrates, not even the minor baronets who used to beg for an invitation to Westford. The social boycott was absolute and devastating. Beatrice had not needed to utter a single word of instruction. The peerage understood the rules of power. To attend Aidan's ball was to legitimize his mistress and insult the Cavendish fortune. Society had chosen its side, and Aidan had been violently ostracized. Aurora stood in the center of the empty ballroom, the crimson silk of her gown looking like an open wound against the pale, freezing floor. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "They are laughing at us," she whispered, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with rage. "They are sitting in their warm estates, drinking their fine wines and laughing at you, Aidan. You are a joke. Aurora, please." Aidan begged, stepping forward to touch her arm. His pride was utterly broken, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "It is the snow. The roads must be impassable. Do not insult my intelligence, she screamed, slapping his hand away with startling violence. It is her. It is your barren, miserable wife. She owns them just as she owned you. Before Aidan could defend himself, the heavy sound of the grand brass knocker echoed through the silent house. Finch, moving with painful slowness, crossed the foyer to open the massive double doors. A single figure stepped out of the swirling snow into the candlelight. It was Lord Richard Montgomery, a ruthlessly successful industrialist who had recently purchased an estate bordering Westford. Montgomery was everything Aidan was not: self-made, obscenely wealthy, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of aristocratic sentimentality. He was a man who bought up failing businesses and stripped them for parts. He handed his heavy fur-lined coat to Finch and strolled into the ballroom, his dark eyes sweeping over the tragic scene, the untouched food, the waiting musicians, the desperate duke, and the furious, beautiful mistress. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Forgive my tardiness, Harrington," Montgomery said, his voice booming in the empty space. "My carriage lost a wheel in the drift, but I see I haven't missed the festivities." Aidan swallowed his humiliation, forcing a stiff, aristocratic bow. "Lord Montgomery, we are delighted you could make it. The weather seems to have deterred our other guests." "Yes, the weather," Montgomery replied dryly, his gaze shifting entirely to Aurora. He walked toward her, his eyes assessing her the way a merchant assesses a prized mare. "And this vision in crimson must be the famous Miss Hayes. The county speaks of little else." Aurora's demeanor shifted with whiplash-inducing speed. The shrieking harpy of 5 minutes ago vanished. She lowered her eyelashes, her lips curving into a soft, vulnerable smile. She recognized power, and more importantly, she smelled money. Montgomery's waistcoat watch chain was solid gold. His diamond stickpin caught the candlelight, and he carried an aura of untouchable security. "You flatter me, my lord," Aurora murmured, extending a gloved hand. Montgomery took it, bowing over it, his lips brushing the fabric just a fraction longer than polite society dictated. "I only speak the truth, madam," Montgomery said smoothly. He turned slightly back to Aidan. "I must confess, Harrington, I did not brave the storm merely for a waltz. I came with a business proposition. I have been watching the decline of your estate's borders, the eastern woodlands specifically. I require timber for my new railway contracts. I am prepared to offer you a generous sum to clear-cut those woods." Aidan's face paled. The eastern woodlands had belonged to Westford since 1603. Selling them to be stripped bare was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was an amputation to save the rotting body of the estate. "The woodlands are not for sale, Montgomery," Aidan said stiffly. "Everything is for sale, Harrington, when the coal runs out," Montgomery countered lightly. He didn't wait for Aidan to argue. He turned his attention entirely back to Aurora. "Miss Hayes, since the Duke is too proud to admit his ship is sinking, perhaps you would do me the honor of a dance. The musicians are being paid for after all." Aidan opened his mouth to object, to order Montgomery out of his home, but before he could draw breath, Aurora stepped smoothly into Montgomery's arms. "I would be delighted, my lord," Aurora said softly, her eyes locked on Montgomery's. Aidan stood in the shadows, entirely forgotten in his own ballroom, watching the woman he had sacrificed his life for waltz away in the arms of his rival. The music swelled, echoing mournfully off the peeling gold leaf of the ceiling. Aurora leaned close to Montgomery, whispering something that made the industrialist throw his head back and laugh. In that bitter, freezing moment, as he watched Aurora's predatory smile, Aidan Harrington finally understood the magnitude of his ruin. Beatrice had taken his wealth, but Aurora was about to take whatever was left of his soul. The weeks following the disastrous winter ball dragged Westford Manor into a state of feral decay. The snowstorms of January buried the estate, isolating the grand house from the rest of the county. Inside, the temperature plummeted so drastically that Aidan and Finch were forced to burn the antique Chippendale chairs from the unused guest rooms just to keep the pipes in the east wing from bursting. Through this freezing purgatory, Lord Richard Montgomery became a frequent and deeply mocking fixture. Under the guise of finalizing the contracts for the eastern woodlands, Montgomery's heavy black carriage, equipped with modern heating stoves, arrived 3 times a week. Aidan, humiliated and backed into a corner by the looming threat of debtor's prison, had agreed to sell the ancient timber. But Montgomery was a predator who enjoyed playing with his food. He drew out the negotiations, demanding endless surveys and legal revisions, all while taking tea in the freezing drawing room with Aurora. Aurora had entirely abandoned the pretense of being a devoted, misunderstood lover. With Beatrice gone, Aidan had served his purpose. He had given her status, but he could not sustain it. Montgomery, however, reeked of newly minted, inexhaustible wealth. While Aidan sat in his study, furiously haggling over pennies with the old steward Aurora, and Montgomery took long walks through the frosty gardens, their heads bent close together, their laughter echoing off the stone walls like shattering glass, Aidan saw it. He felt the betrayal twisting in his gut like a rusted knife, but the paralyzing shame of his situation kept him silent. He had sacrificed his marriage, his reputation, and his estate for this woman. To admit that she was now discarding him for a richer prospect was a reality his fragile ego could not process. The illusion finally collapsed on a bleak, sleet-bitten morning in mid-February. Aidan had been awake since dawn, drafting desperate letters to distant cousins in Scotland, begging for a temporary loan. He emerged from his study to find the grand foyer in a state of chaotic movement. 2 burly men in rough wool coats were hauling a massive steamer trunk down the grand staircase. Aidan's blood ran cold. He recognized the trunk. It was made of fine Moroccan leather purchased by Beatrice for her honeymoon, which Aurora had unceremoniously claimed as her own. He rushed up the stairs, throwing open the doors to the master suite. The room had been ransacked. The armoires were empty, the silk gowns carelessly shoved into boxes. Standing by the vanity, wrapped in a luxurious Russian sable coat that Aidan certainly had not paid for, was Aurora. She was calmly stuffing the last of the Harrington silver, a set of Queen Anne candlesticks, and 3 silver snuff boxes into a velvet satchel. "What are you doing?" Aidan's voice was a ragged, hollow rasp. Aurora did not even flinch. She snapped the satchel shut and turned to face him, her beautiful features set in a mask of supreme indifference. "I am leaving Aidan. Richard's carriage is waiting for me at the bottom of the drive." "Richard Montgomery!" Aidan took a step forward, his hands trembling. "You cannot be serious. After everything I have done for you, after everything I sacrificed. Aurora let out a short, brutal laugh. "Oh, Aidan, do stop playing the tragic poet. You sacrificed nothing but your own pride. You wanted a pet to adore you because your wife was too intelligent to flatter your delusions. Well, your pet is starving and this cage is freezing. I loved you," he shouted, the echo bouncing off the stripped bare walls of the bedroom. "I defied the entire peerage for you. I threw my wife out of this house for you. You threw her out because you were intimidated by her." Aurora sneered, stepping closer, her hazel eyes devoid of the weeping vulnerability that had ensnared him. "And what did your grand defiance buy me frostbite and boiled cabbage? Richard is taking me to Paris. He has leased a townhouse in Mayfair for my return. He understands the value of a beautiful woman, and more importantly, he can afford the upkeep." Aidan reached out, grabbing her arm, his grip desperate. "You are stealing my family's silver." Aurora looked down at his hand, then back up to his face, with a look of utter pity. "Consider it payment for services rendered, Aidan. Besides, if you check the invoices from the dressmakers in London, you will find you owe them nearly £2,000 in my name. The silver will barely cover the interest. Let me go, or I will scream for Richard's men to come up here and break your jaw." Slowly, Aidan's fingers uncurled. The fight drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, echoing void. He stepped back, watching as the woman who had been his childhood fantasy, his grand rebellion, walked past him without a second glance. He followed her down the stairs like a ghost. He stood in the open doorway, the biting winter wind whipping his unkempt hair, and watched Aurora Hayes climb into Lord Montgomery's heated carriage. Montgomery, sitting inside, tipped his silk top hat to Aidan, in a gesture of absolute triumphant mockery. As the carriage rolled down the drive, disappearing into the sleet, Thomas Finch appeared silently at Aidan's elbow. "Your Grace," the old steward said softly, his voice heavy with sorrow. The magistrate's men are here. From York. Aidan turned his eyes blank. The magistrate. Yes, Your Grace. The grocer, the butcher, and the carriage makers have officially petitioned the courts. They have come to seize the furniture on the ground floor. Aidan Harrington, the Duke of Westford, stood in the doorway of his ancestral home and simply nodded. He had chosen the whisper in the dark, and now the darkness had come to collect. While Westford Manor crumbled into a frozen tomb, Lady Beatrice Cavendish was orchestrating a masterpiece of financial warfare from the warmth of London. She had not retreated to a quiet country dower house to weep over her broken marriage, as polite society expected of a scorned wife. Instead, she had taken up residence in her father's palatial townhouse in Grosvenor Square, Mayfair. She hosted exclusive salons attended by politicians, artists, and the elite bankers of the city. She wore silks of deep emerald and sapphire, projecting an aura of untouchable intellectual grace. The upper echelons of London society, notoriously fickle, rallied around her. Aidan's public disgrace with the steward's daughter had made Beatrice a martyr. Her stoic, elegant resilience made her a queen. But behind the velvet curtains of her drawing room, Beatrice was acting as a ruthless corporate raider. On a bright Tuesday morning in early April, Mr. Reginald Abernathy sat across from Beatrice in her private study, a massive stack of vellum documents resting on the mahogany desk between them. It is done, Your Grace. Abernathy said, a rare gleam of predatory satisfaction in his eyes. He adjusted his spectacles, tapping the top document. Through a series of proxy holding companies and discreet negotiations via Coutts & Company, we have successfully purchased all of the Duke's outstanding promissory notes. Beatrice poured a cup of Earl Grey tea, her hand perfectly steady. All of them, Reginald. Even the agricultural debts inherited from the late Duke, every last one. When the local tradesmen in Yorkshire began seizing his furniture, the larger creditors in London panicked. They assumed Westford was bound for total liquidation. We offered to buy the debts at 60 pence to the pound. They were thrilled to unload the liability. Abernathy leaned forward. Your Grace, you now hold the mortgages on the tenant farms, the liens against the manor itself, and over £20,000 of his personal unsecured debt. He legally cannot sneeze without your financial permission. Beatrice took a slow sip of her tea. And the eastern woodlands, sold to Lord Montgomery to cover the winter interest. Abernathy confirmed, his lip curling in distaste. But it merely delayed the inevitable. The principal sum of the estate's debt came due on the 1st of April. The Duke is officially in default. Has he been notified? The formal notices were dispatched to Yorkshire last week by the proxy firm. We informed him that his creditors demand an immediate audience to discuss the foreclosure of Westford Manor. He is scheduled to arrive at my offices on Chancery Lane at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Beatrice set her teacup down. A cold, magnificent smile touched her lips. Excellent. Have my carriage brought around at 2:30, Reginald. I wouldn't miss this meeting for the world. At precisely 3 o'clock, Aidan Harrington walked into the imposing dark wood lobby of Abernathy Cole and Partners. The last 4 months had aged him a decade. His once immaculate tailcoat was slightly frayed at the cuffs. His boots lacked their usual mirror shine, and his storm-grey eyes were haunted by the exhaustion of a man who had not slept soundly since winter. He had come to beg. He had spent the train ride from Yorkshire practicing his pleas, hoping to convince this anonymous syndicate of London bankers to grant him a 6-month extension. He would sell the art, he would sell the remaining land, he would do anything to avoid the final humiliation of eviction. A junior clerk silently led Aidan through the labyrinth of the law firm, finally opening the heavy oak doors to the senior partner's boardroom. The Duke of Westford, the clerk announced, stepping aside. Aidan walked into the room, clutching his top hat to his chest. The boardroom was vast, lined with leather-bound legal texts. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Reginald Abernathy, but it was the figure sitting at the head of the table that made the breath freeze in Aidan's lungs. Beatrice was dressed in an impeccably tailored gown of charcoal wool, her posture as straight as a steel rod. She did not look like a scorned wife. She looked like a sovereign presiding over a conquered territory. Her dark eyes locked onto his entirely devoid of malice, sympathy, or love. She looked at him with the cold calculation of an auditor viewing a bankrupt ledger. Beatrice. Aidan whispered the words, stumbling out of his mouth. He looked wildly around the room, expecting to see a row of stern bankers. What? What are you doing here? Where are the creditors? Beatrice gestured gracefully to the empty chair opposite her. Please sit down, Aidan. You look exhausted. I demand to know what is happening, Abernathy. Aidan snapped a desperate flicker of his old aristocratic arrogance trying to ignite. I was summoned by the firm holding my notes of debt. And so you were, Your Grace, Abernathy said smoothly, not rising from his seat. Allow me to formally introduce you to the sole proprietor of the Cavendish London Syndicate. He gestured toward Beatrice. Aidan's knees gave out. He collapsed into the heavy leather chair, the mahogany table seeming to tilt dangerously beneath his hands. He stared at Beatrice, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the trap he had walked into. You, he breathed, his face draining of all colour. You bought my debts. You bought the mortgages. I am a businesswoman, Aidan. I recognized a heavily devalued asset and I acquired it. Beatrice replied, her voice eerily calm. When you decided to play the romantic martyr and throw my financial support back in my face, I realized Westford Manor would soon collapse. I simply positioned myself at the bottom of the hill to catch the pieces. You planned this. Aidan's voice shook with a toxic mixture of awe and horror. From the day you left, I planned to secure my investment, Beatrice corrected sharply. I spent thousands of pounds of my family's money fixing your crumbling roof, your exhausted soil, and your tarnished name. Did you truly believe I would walk away and let a village grifter and your own incompetence destroy my life's work? She opened a leather folio on the table and slid a single heavily inked document across the polished wood toward him. This is a deed of relinquishment, Aidan. You owe me £85,000 in consolidated debt, a sum you could not raise if you lived 1,000 years. You have two choices today. Beatrice leaned forward, the afternoon light catching the sharp, unforgiving angles of her face. You will sign this document legally, transferring the deeds of Westford Manor, its remaining lands, and all its contents to my name, in perpetuity, to settle the debt. I will grant you a modest annuity of £500 a year, enough to live quietly in a small cottage in Cornwall, or perhaps France. You will never set foot in Yorkshire again. Aidan stared at the paper as if it were a coiled viper. And if I refuse? If you refuse, Beatrice said softly, the lethal trap finally snapping shut, Mr. Abernathy will walk down to the Royal Courts of Justice and file for bankruptcy. You will be dragged into the debtor's court. Your remaining furniture will be auctioned on the lawn. You will be stripped of your peers' privileges, and you will likely end up in Fleet Prison. The choice, Your Grace, is entirely yours. The heavy silence in the boardroom of Abernathy Cole and Partners was broken only by the rhythmic, indifferent ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Aidan Harrington stared at the deed of relinquishment as if it were a warrant for his own execution. The crisp vellum paper covered in dense, unforgiving legal script represented the total annihilation of his bloodline's supremacy. For 500 years, a Harrington had been the unquestioned master of Westford. They had survived civil wars, the Reformation, and the madness of kings. Yet the dynasty was not falling to a siege engine or a rebel army. It was falling to the stroke of a pen, orchestrated by the woman sitting across from him in charcoal wool. You cannot do this, Beatrice Aidan whispered, a desperate final plea cracking his voice. Westford is my birthright. It is the soil of my ancestors. You cannot simply steal it. I am not stealing it, Aidan. I am buying it at a steep discount to save it from the bankruptcy courts. Beatrice replied, her tone devoid of any triumphant gloating. It was pure, icy pragmatism. Your ancestors may have conquered that soil, but you neglected it. You pawned your birthright the moment you decided a childhood infatuation was worth more than the survival of your legacy. I am simply closing the ledger. Aidan looked to Mr. Abernathy, but the solicitor's face was a mask of professional stone. There was no ally for him in this room. There was no Aurora to stroke his ego, no sycophants to call him Your Grace and pretend his word was law. He was cornered, stripped of his illusions, facing the brutal machinery of London capital. His hand shook violently as Reginald Abernathy slid a heavy gold-nibbed fountain pen across the polished mahogany. "The choice remains yours, Your Grace," Abernathy said softly. "Sign and accept the annuity. Refuse and I will summon the bailiffs to escort you to Fleet Prison by nightfall. I assure you the accommodations there are significantly less comfortable than a cottage in Cornwall." Aidan closed his eyes. The memory of the freezing, stripped rooms of Westford Manor flashed behind his eyelids. He remembered the humiliation of Lord Montgomery's mocking laugh, the sight of his family's silver being shoved into a velvet satchel by the woman he had ruined himself for. He had nothing left to fight with. His pride had been hollowed out, leaving only the primal, pathetic instinct for self-preservation. With a suffocating sob that he could not suppress, Aidan picked up the pen. The scratching of the nib against the vellum sounded deafening in the quiet room. He signed his name, Aidan William Harrington, Duke of Westford, relinquishing everything. The manor, the tenant farms, the remaining art, the library, and the very ground he had walked on since childhood. Abernathy swiftly pulled the document away, applying a heavy wax seal to make the transfer irrevocable. Aidan slumped back in his chair, a hollow, broken shell of a man. "You have your prize, Beatrice," he rasped bitterly. "I hope the cold halls of Westford keep you warm at night. You are a victor, but you will rule over an empty house." Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her gown. She looked down at him with a strange clinical pity. "It will not be empty, Aidan. It will be functional. And as for warmth, that is a luxury for those who cannot afford coal. I can afford it." She turned toward the door, but paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Aidan. Since you traded everything for the love of Miss Aurora Hayes, you might be interested in a bit of news Mr. Abernathy received from his associates in Paris this morning." Aidan's head snapped up, a pathetic flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "Lord Montgomery returned to London 2 days ago," Beatrice stated calmly. "Alone." Aidan stared at her, uncomprehending. "But Aurora. He took Aurora to Paris." "He took her to Paris, yes." Abernathy interjected, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "And once the timber contracts were finalised and safely filed, Lord Montgomery found himself thoroughly bored with her constant demands for new jewellery. He evicted her from the Mayfair townhouse lease and left her at a rather cheap boarding house in Montmartre. It seems Miss Hayes overestimated her market value. She sent a telegram to my office yesterday begging to be put in contact with you." The air rushed out of Aidan's lungs. Aurora had not just abandoned him for a richer man. She had been used, discarded, and now she was crawling back. The grand tragic romance that had cost him a dukedom was nothing more than a cheap farcical transaction, and he was the only one foolish enough to have paid full price. "I assume you did not give her my direction," Aidan mumbled, staring blankly at the floor. "I told her that the Duke of Westford was entirely bankrupt and had no funds to offer," Abernathy replied, adjusting his spectacles. She did not reply. Beatrice opened the heavy oak door. "Your first annuity cheque is waiting with the clerk, Aidan. Do not return to Yorkshire. Goodbye." The door clicked shut, leaving Aidan Harrington alone with the solicitor, a £500 cheque, and the crushing realisation that he had destroyed his own life for an illusion that had shattered at the first touch of reality. Spring arrived in Yorkshire with a brilliant, defiant burst of green, melting the last remnants of the bitter winter that had nearly killed Westford Manor. A heavy polished carriage bearing the Cavendish crest, not the Harrington coat of arms, crunched along the freshly raked gravel of the main drive. Lady Beatrice Cavendish, legally still the Duchess of Westford, but practically operating as a sovereign queen, stepped down before the grand Palladian steps. Thomas Finch, the old steward, stood waiting by the open double doors. He looked healthier than he had in months. The skeleton crew of servants had been replaced by a fully staffed, well-paid and meticulously organised household. The dust sheets were gone, the fires were roaring in the hearths, and the scaffolding had returned to the east wing, manned by a small army of stonemasons. Finch bowed deeply. "Welcome home, Your Grace." Beatrice looked up at the towering stone facade. It was no longer a tomb. It was hers. "Thank you, Finch. Have the new agricultural blueprints been placed in my study?" "They have, Your Grace, along with the ledgers from the coal merchants. They were quite eager to resume business once your solicitors guaranteed the accounts." I am sure they were, Beatrice murmured, stepping into the warm, gleaming foyer. She did not seek a divorce. In the eyes of Victorian society, divorce was a scandal that left a stain on the woman, regardless of the husband's faults. More importantly, remaining married meant she retained the title of Duchess of Westford, a social armour that made her untouchable in London society. Aidan remained legally tied to her, but entirely exiled a phantom duke who existed only as a signature on a quarterly bank draft. Over the next decade, Beatrice transformed the Westford estate from a decaying aristocratic relic into a modern, hyper-profitable powerhouse. She used her Cavendish capital to build a private railway spur connecting the estate's agricultural output directly to the markets in Leeds. She rebuilt the tenant cottages, constructed a school for the village children, and ruthlessly bought out Lord Montgomery's timber operations when his own investments floundered in a market crash. She ruled alone, formidable and respected, known throughout the county as the Iron Duchess. The local nobility who had boycotted Aidan's phantom ball now eagerly sought invitations to her grand summer garden parties. They whispered about the exiled duke, of course, but the whispers were filled with mockery for the man and awe for the woman who had bested him. Far across the English Channel, in the sleepy salt-sprayed coastal village of Saint-Malo in Brittany, Aidan Harrington lived a life of suffocating mediocrity. His £500 annuity was enough to secure a damp two-room cottage overlooking the grey Atlantic and afford him a daily supply of cheap French wine. The aristocratic arrogance that had once defined him had rotted away, replaced by a deep, lingering bitterness that aged him prematurely. He grew a ragged beard, his tailored suits replaced by coarse wool sweaters. To the local fishermen, he was simply Monsieur Aidan, a quiet, melancholy Englishman who drank too much and spoke to no one. One rainy afternoon in 1896, 12 years after he had signed away his birthright, Aidan sat in the corner of a local tavern reading a month-old copy of the Illustrated London News that a passing traveller had left behind. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to the society pages. There, dominating the page, was a sketch of Westford Manor. It looked magnificent, grander than he had ever seen it in his lifetime. Below the illustration was an article detailing the grand opening of the new Westford Hospital, funded entirely by the Duchess of Westford. The article praised her business acumen, her philanthropy, and her peerless grace. The name Harrington was mentioned only in passing. It was the Cavendish wealth and the Duchess's iron will that were celebrated. Aidan traced the outline of the manor with a trembling, calloused finger. The estate had not needed him. It had only needed him to leave. He had convinced himself that Aurora Hayes was his true destiny, that romantic rebellion was nobler than pragmatic duty. But as he sat in the dim, smoky tavern, the brutal truth finally settled into his bones. He was not a tragic romantic hero. He was the rot in the foundation of his own house. Beatrice had not just saved Westford. She had surgically removed him to let it thrive. He closed the paper, pushing away his half-empty glass of wine. He stood up and walked out into the cold, biting rain, heading toward the ruined walls of an old monastery at the edge of the cliffs, a place he frequented because the crumbling stones reminded him of the life he had destroyed. Aidan Harrington, the last true Duke of Westford, died 3 years later of pneumonia, entirely alone. His passing was marked by a brief 3-line obituary in the back pages of the Times. Beatrice did not attend his funeral, nor did she bring his body back to the ancestral crypt in Yorkshire. She ordered him buried in a modest grave in France. When the news of his death arrived at Westford Manor, the Iron Duchess simply nodded, signed the final ledger, closing his annuity account, and went back to the business of running her empire. She had won the war, proving to history that a kingdom is not held by the man who inherits the crown, but by the woman who holds the gold and the iron will to use it. What a devastating twist of fate. Aidan Harrington traded a 500-year legacy for a fleeting illusion, only to realize the woman he discarded was the true mastermind holding his empire together. Beatrice didn't just survive his betrayal. Tar weaponized it, proving that true power isn't inherited. It's claimed. If you were captivated by this tale of aristocratic arrogance, brutal revenge, and the ultimate checkmate, please hit that like button Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant historical drama, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories of scandal and survival.